Welcome back to On the Move with Victor Shi. This is Victor Shi. It is Tuesday, May 23rd, and today we are going to set the record straight on something that I know is getting a lot of attention in DC, and that is the debt ceiling and the possibility for the first time in U.S. history of the U.S. reaching default, and that is in no small part because of Kevin McCarthy. The good news is that as we are speaking right now, there seems to be improvements between the White House and Republicans, that there might be some slight progress being made on avoiding default, but nonetheless, it should be concerning to all of us that Kevin McCarthy wants to cut things like veteran benefits, President Biden's student loan program, and other programs that would benefit working families. So today we're going to talk about all of that, what that will mean for our country. In addition, we're also going to talk about 2024 and specifically what it will take to defeat Ted Cruz in Texas. And to help me do that, I am so glad to be joined by Ted Cruz's opponent in the 2024 Senate race in Texas and a U.S. Representative, Colin Allred. Colin, it is so great to see you. Thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is great.
So I have so much to ask you about your state and beating Ted Cruz, but first I want to ask you about this looming default crisis. Yesterday, you and your colleagues were on the House floor giving speeches, and there were no Republicans present. So I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of kind of where things are right now, what's happening. Are we getting any closer to a deal right now?
Yeah. Well, right now, the Republicans are threatening to default on America unless they get a wish list of their policy proposals that they know they could not get any other way. And we've seen this brinksmanship before from them, but probably never seen a caucus quite like this on the Republican side. So when John Boehner was doing this with President Obama in 2013, that was a very different Republican caucus than the one we have now, one that I think has a number of members who are more than willing to see us default. Of course, we've seen that former President Trump has told them to do that. And you know how much some of these folks do listen to that. And so it's a really dangerous situation. From what I understand, it does look like a deal is close. It's going to be not on the debt ceiling itself. It's on a separate track, which is on the budget. And the budget and the debt ceiling are separate, and folks have to understand that. But I think we'll raise and make sure that we don't default. And then we'll have a separate deal on the budget to keep the government open.
Interesting. And as we all remember, it took Kevin McCarthy, I think, 15 tries to become speaker. And one of the things I know concerned a lot of us during that time were the type of deals that he made so he can become speaker. And I want to ask you, I mean, is there anything that you're seeing now, whether it's, from Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, any of those far right Republicans that shows you or tells you some of those kind of deals that he made to become speaker in this debt ceiling fight?
Well, just the other day, we had Marjorie Taylor Greene sitting in the speaker's chair, gabbling us and telling us to observe decorum, as if she's ever shown any kind of hint or of being able to show decorum in her own life, or certainly in her time in Congress. The folks who are on the far fringes of the right wing have been brought fully into the fold and are part of this leadership team on the Republican side, are part of these negotiations. And we all have to be very concerned about that, because their demands are not only unrealistic, but they're incredibly damaging to the country. And so I think what will end up happening will likely be that Speaker McCarthy is going to have to choose in many ways between doing the right thing for his country or appeasing his right-wing caucus. If he does the right thing for the country and allows us to reach some kind of agreement, it's not going to be all the things that I would want in it.
Yes.
But I do think that we'll probably see them try to move to then remove him from the speaker's chair. And that's part of also some of the agreements that he made at the beginning to make it pretty easy to make a motion like that.
So, I mean, after all of this, I mean, this is something I think no one wants to see our country in, the possibility of a default for the first time in human history. But assuming that we reach a deal and assuming that something does get passed and so hopefully the near future, how do you hope Americans will see this? Because I think a lot of people are going to see, President Biden in the presidency and cast blame on him. But how do you think Americans should see this? What should be their takeaway after all of this?
Well, that we have seen this for some time now, that it's incumbent on us on the Democratic side to be the adults in the room in every negotiation, to be the ones to make sure that we don't default on America, which will then lead to American families having to default on their own bills, to make sure that we can keep the government open, to respond and make sure that we actually count the electoral college votes and actually have a peaceful transfer of power. Over and over and over again, we've seen how extreme this Republican Party has become, And it's not just in politics. They've moved it, of course, into impacting your life. That's why we are
Yeah.
now in the post-Roe America, in which in states like mine, women
Yeah.
no longer have the right to an abortion or to control their own reproductive future. That's the result of this extremism, and it's impacting us every single day. This is no way, as I think I saw some headlines saying, this is no way to run a superpower. We are
No.
not alone in the world in terms of trying to lead kind of the free world. We have some polar opposites like China that are out there that are looking at going in a very different direction, and they
Yeah.
point at our political dysfunction and say, "See, I'm telling you,
Mhm,
the American
mhm.
route is not the route to go. Come with us."
But if there's any hope in all of this and seeing kind of what happened this week in Congress and over the past few months, is that Democrats at least are more united than ever before and against this Republican Party that's, as they say, in disarray. You mentioned Texas, and I want to get into Texas because that is a race that I'm sure the nation is paying very close attention to, and a race that I desperately want you to win because Texas deserves better. First, give our audience a sense of kind of who you are, a little bit more about you, and why you think you're the best person to go up against Ted Cruz.
Yeah. Well, I'm a fourth generation Texan, and I have a story to tell about our state that's very different from the one that Ted Cruz represents, or that too often is being associated with us by some of our political leaders.
Yeah.
I know that Texans can't afford 6 more years of Ted Cruz, because if we are who he said we are, then my life would have been possible. I
Mm.
was raised by a single mother in the district that I now represent. She was a public school teacher. And for us, it wasn't easy, but I relied on our community, on the YMCA, on the public schools I went
Yeah.
to give me a shot that allowed me to make it to the NFL, to become a lawyer, to serve in the Obama administration, and ultimately to run for Congress in my hometown, to be a 22-year incumbent who was the uh, chairman of the Rules Committee at the time, pretty handily, 6.5 points, to win a tough reelection, and to now be in my third term, in the Congress, and have been, brought together a coalition of folks that usually don't see supporting a Democrat, quite honestly. I've
Mhm.
been endorsed both by organized labor, including AFL-CIO in my reelection bids, but also by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, because it's really important. And I think that the Democratic Party is the more pro-business party right now. Certainly, I consider myself more pro-business than Ted Cruz, while also
Yeah.
respecting the right of workers. It's possible, and it's possible to bring and to bridge some of these divides. We have to do it. Because for us, as I said, we can't afford 6 more years of a senator who, when we're freezing in the dark, decides to go on vacation, or who's leading an insurrection, or who's podcasting 3 times a week, which is what he's doing right now.
I mean, it seems like his end goal isn't to actually represent Texans; it's to get attention and to go on Fox News and
That's
all
right.
these right wing media sources. But I
And to
want to
sell
talk about.
books.
And to sell books. Yes, exactly. One of the things that drives me insane when people talk about Texas is that they automatically assume that it's a red state, but in reality, it's a state that has just been so gerrymandered and suppressed in terms of voting. And how are you and your campaign pushing back against that effort? How big of a challenge is that?
Yeah, I was a voting rights lawyer before I came to Congress. Voting rights to me is preservative of all other rights, which means it's a Supreme Court line from a long ago Supreme Court, not nearly as bad as this one on voting rights.
Yeah.
Because if you can vote, then you can protect yourself. You can form coalitions. You can elect candidates who will fight for the things that you care about in your legislative bodies. But if you can't, then you have no voice in your democracy. Unfortunately, Texas is probably the hardest state to vote in the nation. And I say that from an informed perspective. We make it hard to register to vote, make it hard to cast your ballot, and even after you cast your ballot, we dilute it through, as you said, gerrymandering. And when you do that over enough time, you can build in a cynicism and also just a lack of a culture of being involved politically and democratically, and we have to overcome that. But in my congressional race in 2018, when we flipped this seat, we ran into a similar situation where most folks in my area just weren't used to knocking on doors or making phone calls or asking their neighbors about politics, even because it was uncomfortable. And for years, there really hadn't been competitive races and no reason to do that. Well, I think we'll run into some of the same kind of scar tissue where we have to, do some educating on how to do this. It's helped that we've had, Beto O'Rourke run, some
Yeah.
close campaigns and move that ball forward in terms of people getting involved. But we know that in our state, 9.6 million registered voters didn't vote in the last election.
Mhm,
That's
mhm.
about a million more than who did. So did not vote won the last election, hands down. We have to change that.
You mentioned the people who did not vote, and I want to ask you about that later on because young voters I know are going to be key in Texas in 2024. But you mentioned also better or work, and that was something I wanted to ask you because he won, or I guess he ran against Ted Cruz. I wish he won, but he built this coalition that was really strong, and we saw him go across county after county after county, but yet he still came short. And I'm wondering what lessons kind of you can take from what Beto ran and how you're going to make that better, and kind of what your strategy is going forward.
I think Beto ran a strong campaign, particularly in 2018, of getting folks involved. He benefited also, quite honestly, from that. We had a ton of competitive races down ballot in congressional races and state house races and state senate races. So many folks were trying to turn out the vote, and of course, we for a midterm we had really excellent turnout in 2018. So we have to build on that. The coalition that we've shown in my congressional races, that's a winning coalition, is one that is made up of, yes, Republicans and independents who aren't comfortable with this version of the Republican Party, aren't comfortable with the kind of MAGA strain, and certainly I think will not be comfortable with Ted Cruz. But then also targeting and working with communities where we know they're having some struggle getting out to vote, and spending a lot of time and effort on it. And there really is no substitute for that. It really does just take a lot of time and effort, and we've shown that we know how to do that. And so when you can kind of bridge those two concepts of expanding who is willing to vote for a Democrat like me, and then also expanding who is going to vote at all, then you end up with something really powerful. And I think Ted Cruz presents an opportunity for us in that we have to build on what has gone before. But also, it's just true that Ted Cruz has shown over his last 6 years that he doesn't deserve to have 6 more years. And that's what it's going to be about.
Absolutely. And I want to ask about young voters because in 2022, there was some concerning statistics about kind of the number of young voters who turned out. And as we know, I mean, across the country, it seems like young voters are going to make the key difference in 2024. But Texas, at the same time, is also making a very concerted effort to ban basically all college polling locations, as well as making it harder for young people to vote anyway. You mentioned the importance of education, but how have those conversations been like with young voters and mobilizing our generation to turn out and vote in 2024?
It's so critical. But what I've seen is that young voters really do care, and they're paying close attention, particularly, of course, after the Dobbs decision came down. And now, restricting the rights of women. That happened in our state, unfortunately, even before that ruling came down, because of a state law that placed a bounty on women in our state. And so, the young voters and the young folks who work on my campaigns are really inspiring to me, because I know, as you said, how many hurdles are trying to be put in their way. And when I talk to young voters, I try and talk to them about why are they trying to make it so hard for you to vote, and what would be the motivation behind that, and doesn't that annoy you? Does that upset you that you wouldn't let your grandparents pick your playlist for the next 6 years? Why would you let them pick your senator, right? So this is about your future more than anybody else's. And if you're not at the table, you're going to be on the menu. And so it's up to us on our campaign, and hopefully we'll be able to inspire young people about what we can do together, about who our state really is, and that it's not what Ted Cruz says it is. But it's also incumbent upon young people to recognize their power. And I think the folks who I've met who do are so inspiring, because I know all the hurdles that are in their way.
Yeah. The last thing I want to touch upon before we end the episode is what you will do for Texas if you get elected to the Senate in 2024. I know a lot of people are talking about the filibuster. I'm wondering what you think about the filibuster, and whether or not you would eliminate that if you were enacted, and maybe just quickly touch upon some of the other policies you want to focus on.
To me, I've always said if I could wave a magic wand, I would address voting rights and campaign finance. I think so many of our problems stem from those two things. The fact that in many ways our elections can be rigged by money, and we can see enormous amounts of money is going to be spent, attacking me in this election, has been spent attacking me in my past elections. Yeah. We have to address that as much as we can, even with this Supreme Court, but also expanding the right to vote and preserving our democracy. We came so close, in the last presidential transition to seeing our democracy go in a very different direction. Yeah. And we cannot accept that. But it's also true that Texas has some unique challenges. We have the highest uninsured rate in the country. We have people who are literally dying because they can't afford their health care. We have to address that, lowering the cost of prescription drugs, expanding coverage, taking care of Texans. We know that we also have some of the biggest inequality of any state. Dallas, where I'm from, is in many cases a tale of two cities, where you can cross basically a bridge and end up in a very different place. We have to expand this prosperity that we've been blessed with in Texas and make it applicable to everyone, and particularly for our young people. I want to make sure that they can afford to get an education, that they can afford to buy a home, they can start a family. So many of the criticisms that I think are kind of lobbed at people your age about how you're not doing this, or you're starting some of these things later in life, are not actually your fault. They are financial difficulties, and it's because of some of the financial choices that we've made. And we can address that together. But it's going to take a group effort. It's going to take Texans talking to Texans, neighbors talking to neighbors. I know we can do it, but it's going to take all of us.
And does part of that mean, for example, especially on voting rights and reforming campaign finance laws and elections, does part of that mean getting rid of the filibuster? Do you think?
I've called for this before. Listen, regardless of how you feel about the filibuster, in my opinion, it has no place dealing with democracy issues. So you cannot have basically a Senate rule prevent you from addressing issues with your democracy. Otherwise, the Senate rule itself is self-perpetuating, if you understand what I'm saying. And so to me, if we are not able to have a full, leaving the filibuster behind, then we certainly need to have an exception, for voting rights, or for what I would also consider campaign finance issues, because it's at the base of all other issues. We've done this in plenty of areas, actually. They've lowered the 60 vote threshold, for Supreme Court justices. They've lowered it for cabinet officials. We've lowered it in the budget context when we do it through a process called reconciliation. So it's not like we haven't created plenty of carve-outs in the filibuster in the Senate. I certainly think that we should do that, around democracy issues.
It's about whether or not senators have the courage and the political will to do so, but I'm glad that you do. What is the most important thing our audience can do to make sure that to help your campaign to defeat Ted Cruz? Give our audience some information and resources.
Yeah. Well, listen, I encourage everybody to go to colinallred.com and get involved with us. We need your help. As I said, we got a lot of folks who we need to get involved in our democracy. A lot of them need help in order to get involved with it. When I was doing voting rights, I would always be struck by the number of hurdles that were in people's way, but I was also be inspired by the fact that they wanted to overcome them if they knew how to. And so that kind of voter education process, it's labor intensive, but it's one that we can do, and that's one that volunteers in particular can help folks navigate. I really believe in our state. I really believe in Texas, and I believe in a very different Texas than Ted Cruz is. And if you do too, go to colinallred.com and get involved.
Representative Allred, thank you so much. Hopefully soon to be Senator Representative Allred. I know we have a lot of work to do. Thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Yeah, thanks, Victor.
Of course. Thanks so much. Well, Representative Allred is an extraordinary candidate, as we could all probably see in this interview. I think he is definitely the person to run against Ted Cruz, to hopefully beat Ted Cruz in 2024. But like you said, this is a state, or like we've been saying this discussion, don't assume that Texas is a red state. It's just a state that has been gerrymandered a lot. It's a state that is trying to suppress voters, but we have to do our part and go out there and just vote, register people to vote, inform people of how to vote, how to register to vote. Those are going to be so important in 2024, and also expanding the franchise so that people can vote. And so that's going to be critical. And Representative Allred, he gives me hope. His campaign gives me hope. The number of young people on his campaign give me hope. And it seems like Texas hopefully is paying attention, starting to kind of wake up to what is happening in Texas. But we will be talking a lot more about that race in the months to come, I am sure. There's some other news I want to get into before the weekend starts. The first is that there's some pretty big news yesterday about a new conviction by the DOJ, I guess a new sentencing by the DOJ. Basically, the Oath Keepers leader, Stuart Rhodes, has been sentenced to 18 years in prison for seditious conspiracy. For anyone who has been following these things, that is humongous. I mean, this is worth noting, that this is the longest sentence out of any January 6th defendant so far. Pretty significant, and I think great news for anyone who cares about democracy, who cares about what's happening with these January 6 cases. Seditious conspiracy is so hard to prove in court, but then to be sentenced for 18 years in prison is quite significant. So hopefully this is the first of many sentences. Hopefully Donald Trump is next. We'll see what Jack Smith is going to do, but it seems like Jack Smith is really narrowing in on a potential indictment of Donald Trump. And I read to you the letter that Donald Trump's lawyer sent to Merrick Garland, which then he then rejected, saying that you have to talk to Jack Smith about this. But it seems like Trump's lawyers are concerned, and for very good reason, because when you mess around and when you break laws, you will find out, especially with a prosecutor like Jack Smith. And I think the last time I talked to you all, it was before Ron DeSantis launched his pretty failure of a political campaign. He was on, as we all know, Twitter Spaces with Elon Musk, trying to launch his political campaign. There were technical difficulties after technical difficulties. It was such a bad campaign. And the best part wasn't even the failure. It was the response by President Biden's digital team in launching new ads that attacked not only Ron DeSantis' policies, like, trying to get rid of abortion, trying to get rid of Social Security and Medicare, but also for this total complete failure of a presidential campaign, and seeing kind of Dark Brandon at his best, and seeing Joe Biden really kind of go after his opponents. And it's just refreshing to me to see all of that happening right now, to see President Biden not being afraid to hold back, and seeing his digital team really put out these amazing messages out there. So we'll see what happens with Ron DeSantis's campaign going forward, but it's not something that I'm very, very optimistic about, because this is, again, someone who thinks that Florida is representative of the broader electorate, where it's really not. And even Floridians don't really like him. On the day that he announced, there were protests across Florida, basically saying, Florida does not deserve Ron DeSantis. Florida hates Ron DeSantis. So there's a lot of people in Florida who also don't approve of him. And I think he's going to be a losing candidate. And I wouldn't be surprised if he drops out very, very quickly. But I think it's Donald Trump's game to lose, at least in the primary. In the general election, I think he's going to struggle a little bit more. But Ron DeSantis, I think, is going to be up against something very, very challenging in the months to come. And we will definitely do episodes covering his campaign, covering his candidacy, his governorship, because it's not going away anytime soon. And he's just kind of doing these same things again and again, which is waging a war on all of our rights, on the young people, on what we can learn, on what we can do in the classroom. And it's not freedom. It's not pro-business. It's not anything that Republicans want you to believe it is. So we will be covering that in the months going forward. But just a quick programming note, we will be back next week, not on Monday, not on Tuesday, but on Wednesday. And then we'll be back Wednesday, Thursday, Friday with new episodes of On the Move. You don't want to miss them. We have some great guests lined up for you in the weeks to come. So don't miss that. I will be back every day at 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern, right here on youtube.com/Politicon, or right here on Twitter, which I know this is the first day that we are broadcasting live on Twitter. So tune in either on Twitter or on YouTube at youtube.com/Politicon, and be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Thank you all for watching this episode with Representative Colin Allred. Be sure to check out his website, phone bank. If you can get down in Texas, knock some doors. That is going to be such an important race, and Representative Allred gives me hope. So thank you, Representative Allred. Thank you all for watching this week, and I will see you all next week.